As people start to join us, I'm going to go through a couple of admin items. Welcome to AHA with Amplify. Very excited about today. I think we have record-breaking attendance, actually. Might even be beating our in COVID numbers, which is bizarre. But then again, it is ethics, and that's a hot topic, whether we like it or not. We all need to learn it annually. So we're excited. Or maybe it's the fact that we have Gerard here and everybody remembers him from last time and wants to join us. So thank you so much for your participation and for joining Amplify and AHA with Amplify. So a couple really exciting things I want to bring to your attention before we get into today's topic. So I'm going to share my screen, which I usually am not the one that shares screen, so be patient with me here. Okay, we have our Tech Thursdays, and we are almost done, but you can certainly send us a note if you would like to get access to the videos of the ones that we've already gone through. In March, Tech Thursdays are every Thursday, and we're talking emerging ERPs. So we had the opportunity to introduce emerging ERPs. Last week, we compared two of the best emerging ERPs, which happen to be the ones that Amplify Tech is partners with. So we compared NetSuite and Acumatica. This Thursday, we have an opportunity to do a demo with NetSuite. So this is a really exciting opportunity for you to see NetSuite in action and see what it looks like. And obviously, most of the time, in order to see a demo of this level, you would have to be in a sales process. And this is an opportunity to see NetSuite without being committed to the full process of a sales cycle. So very exciting that we have that chance this Thursday. So make sure to sign up, and Nikki will put the links for the webinars in the chat. And we would love if you came and watched our NetSuite demo. And then the last Thursday, our last Tech Thursday, same thing with Acumatica. So many of you know we're incredibly excited to be an Acumatica partner. We just recently signed up. We now are representing and licensing and implementing and consulting with the two best emerging ERPs for growth businesses. And Acumatica is our latest venture. So we'll be sharing a demo of Acumatica. We have the Acumatica people supporting us since we're new. They're going to help us out. And we're really thrilled to be able to show that to you on the 28th. So Tech Thursdays has been all of March. We're half done. You're welcome to ping us to get the videos of the first two, and be sure to join us live. CPD certificates will be given out for these demos, and it's a really good learning opportunity to see these softwares in action. In the spirit of emerging ERPs and everything that's happening with Amplify Tech, we do have a campaign. We are doing a free implementation. And so that seems crazy, but Jesse convinced me it was a good idea. So we're giving out a free implementation. Terms and conditions, Josh can tell you about. So be sure to reach out and get that information and become an applicant for the free implementation campaign. Every single applicant that joins the campaign does get 35% off of their implementation. So you could win and have a big win with a free implementation, but every single applicant is a winner with the 35% off. So it's a really exciting and aggressive campaign. And I was a bit nervous as the person in charge of marketing and sales, but Amplify Tech wanted to make a big splash. And so here we go. That's their big splash, an exciting campaign. Lots is happening here at Amplify. The other thing I want to tell you about is that on April 4th, we're having our live AHA with Amplify. And so this, logistically, this is going to sell out because there's only a certain number of seats available. So you do not want to hesitate. We're over half sold out now, and we only let the public know about it over the weekend. So we're really thrilled to have a client of ours and a supporter of ours join us. Avante, David and Amin are coming live to talk about their entrepreneurial story. So that's an exciting story. We could probably take an hour just hearing about how they became entrepreneurs. But we're also going to talk about search funds. And so this is a new concept that has come to Canada and has been known in North America for about 10 years or so. If you don't know what a search fund is, this is the session to join and learn what a search fund is. If you have some ideas of what a search fund is, or if you're an expert at search funds, this is still a great opportunity to hear real life stories from David and Min, who have been working with search funds for most of their career. So very excited to introduce that concept to our AHA with Amplify members. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how technology can save costs. So along with our spring theme that we were just talking about with Tech Thursdays and our free implementation campaign, we're going to hear some real life stories from David and Amin and how Avante has seen their clients actually save money through the use of technology. So 3 important subjects. My biggest stress is how we're going to fit it all in to an hour. I have a similar stress with Gerard's stories because there's so many things about governance and ethics that I'm pretty sure we're going to end up using the full 90 minutes today. Last, before we get into that 90 minutes of chat with Gerard, I want to let you know that our AHA with Amplify, that you're joining us today, third Tuesday, of every single month. What's happening next month in April? Well, we're going to have talent, and we're going to have our own recruiting team join us to do a session on talent. And so as you can appreciate, they see it firsthand as recruiters, as people talking to candidates and hiring managers every day. So it's going to be some pretty candid stories and some pretty exciting talk. We don't usually have amplifiers as our guests, so this is a rare occurrence as well. So please be sure to see them and support them on our April webinar, the 3rd Tuesday of April. In May, we're doing a personal CFO session. So very thrilled to have Ryan join us. He's a personal CFO, and we're going to see the other side of the story when it comes to CFOing and how he can help clients in terms of their family and estate. And obviously we share a lot of clients because some of those are business owners, and we only look at the corporate business side here at Amplify, of course. And then our last session for the year, I cannot believe we're already talking about June, but we're going to have HR. So Kristen Straight is going to come and join us in regards to HR for June. And so there is so much happening. Live AHA April 4th, Tech Thursday this Thursday, next Thursday, and then of course our AHA with Amplify every 3rd Tuesday. So it is a lot. Be sure to register, be sure to join us. We really appreciate your support and the opportunity to help growing businesses grow through this type of thought leadership and CPD opportunity. Without further ado, I'd love to hear from you, Gerard, and I'm really excited about governance and ethics, the topic of the day.
Well, thanks so much, and thank you everyone who's choosing to spend your lunch hour with us today. As Jamie alluded, we're going to have conversation. It's kind of the style I like, so we're not going to have death by PowerPoint here. The consequence of that is that we might jump around a little bit, so please be patient with us as we do that. A little bit on the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit, just a refresh on personal ethic concepts. I know you spend time at least once a year on ethics with Jamie, so we're not going to spend a lot of time there, but you'll understand why I want to start with personal ethics, because it really then ties in directly to individuals as they then start to participate as board members. We're going to spend quite a bit of time discussing examples of board dilemmas, some of them close to home actually, and Q&A with Jamie and I, but also we're going to leave lots of time for Q&A with you folks as well. So with that, we are going to start with a couple quick polling questions. And Jamie, if you put up the first one, I really just want to ask in one word, what word would you use to define ethics? So that's the question we'll put up.
All right, I've launched that poll, so if everybody can participate, we'll share the results as soon as we get a decent number of you giving us your answer. How do you define ethics? You're starting out with a hard one.
That should be a lot, awesome.
And those of you pulling out ChatGPT to get an answer, no. He wants to know your personal definition of ethics, not the AI's definition of ethics.
Yeah, keep it simple. I was just saying one word. If you had to use one word to substitute for ethics.
All right, we're going to give you 5 more seconds, and if you miss the chance, quicker fingers next poll. We've got 70% participation already, so the rest of them probably have a sandwich on their hands and can't help. So I'm going to end the poll right now and share the results. All right. So we have integrity as a winning idea, and we have morale as a close winning idea. We have trust.
Yeah.
What else do we got here? Regulations, transparency, honesty, moral guidelines,
Yeah.
answering using ChatGPT, not be ethical, someone thought. That's an interesting perspective, right? Doing what is always right, doing the right thing, honesty, right, morality, legal, behavior, fair, accountability, lifestyle. Are those what you expected to hear?
That's exactly what I expect. So, you know, I had listed myself probably a half a dozen, just thinking what would come back, and integrity, trust, morals, honesty, right? So that's exactly what I was expecting. So, I mean, you know, I think simply put, ethics is that concept of right or wrong, you know, good or bad, doing the right thing, right? But we're going to build on that and explore that. So let's go up now with us. We're just going to do a handful of polling questions, still on this concept of personal ethics, and then we'll come back and I'll build on it from there. So if I could ask you to put those up, Jamie.
Yeah, the next one is, you're aware of a mistake you made at work that could negatively impact a project. Do you admit your mistake to your supervisor and take responsibility for the consequences? Do you attempt to fix the mistake on your own without involving others? Or do you stay silent and hope no one notices the error? So we'll give you guys about 45 seconds to answer. We've got pretty quick fingers here and pretty consistent answers so far.
Yeah. Yeah, these should all be pretty short snappers, I think.
Okay, 5 seconds more. And I'm going to end this poll and share the results. So an overwhelming consistency on the admit your mistake to your supervisor, take responsibilities for the consequence.
Yep. Okay, we'll move to number 2.
Sorry, I think I have to stop sharing that one in order to launch the next one. There we go. And so personal ethical dilemma number 2, you're given too much change back after a purchase. Do you return the excess change to the cashier, keep the extra money without saying anything, or inform the cashier about the mistake but keep the excess change if they do not notice? Can we put number 4 and wonder, where did I get cash? I never have cash. Who gave me the cash? I must have got that unethically.
Yeah,
I'm like, I stole that from my husband.
Definitely doesn't occur as much as it used to, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can reflect back at the time though when it did occur. So
Yeah, I'm just teasing you. Okay, 2 more seconds, guys. We've got an overwhelming consistency on this one too, and everybody's giving that excess cash back. So awesome.
Good. Okay, maybe skip the number 3 and go Jamie to the first couple of the work related situation.
Perfect. Okay, so the first workplace one we have is, what should the senior manager prioritize when discovering a team member engaged in fraudulent activities? Should they have loyalty to the colleague, ethical responsibility to report the misconduct, find a compromise solution, or seek guidance from an HR or ethics committee? So what should a senior manager prioritize when discovering a team manager has participated in fraudulent activities? Not an easy moment for anyone, I'm sure, especially if it's your friend. Okay, 5 more seconds for this one. Not as consistent in the answers, not at all as consistent. You're making it harder on us, I guess. All right, so 64% said ethical responsibility to report the misconduct. 35% said they would seek guidance from HR or an ethics committee. 1% said they would find a compromise solution. Nobody voted loyalty to their colleague.
Okay, good.
Now all of their colleagues are worried that loyalty doesn't matter to them.
Just do one more of those, Jamie.
Perfect. Okay. Workplace dilemma number 2. How should the senior manager respond to pressure to manipulate financial data for performance targets? Should they uphold personal integrity and refuse to comply? Follow directives to avoid consequences? Report the issue to relevant authorities, or seek support from colleagues or ethics expert? So close to home for many of our AHA members, I'm sure. In fact, probably actually has happened to a good number of our members that have joined us here today.
And it's going to come up in one of the examples we talk about in a bit.
Perfect. So a couple more seconds. We got some good participation, so I'll give you a minute. 75% participate, so 5 more seconds. And so we've got 60% said they'd uphold personal integrity and refuse to comply. 2% they would follow directives and avoid consequences. 15% said they would report the issue to relevant authorities, and 23% said they would seek support from colleagues or ethics experts. Did you want to do any others right now?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Thanks, Jamie. And the reason I wanted to start with personal ethics is you start to see how the situations can start to become a little bit more complex. And yeah, we started to see there's a little bit more variance in those answers. And you think about why that is, and if you think about what influences personal ethics, and there's just a half a dozen factors that just came to mind for me. Family and friends, like who do you hang out with? You know, who's influencing maybe how you think from day to day? Your parents and your upbringing, religion, political views, gender, culture or societal norms that you grew up with, and age. What's interesting about a few of those, because there's been a lot of studies done on these, gender, for example, and this is a generalization, but it has come from study results, that women tend to have a higher standard when it comes to ethical decision making. Age, it's been studied again that the older you are, the more bothered you are by what you do to be unethical decisions. So, and then with culture, there are again studies done across the world with different ethical standards based on different country norms. So in some countries, ethical behavior is put below maximizing profit, or actually said in the inverse, maintaining a high ethical standard will negatively impact profit. And so these are just examples when you start to think about when you put people together in a group. And the reason I wanted to start with a little bit of a reflection on personal ethics is when you start to put people together to form a board, you know, how, if there's 6 or 7 or 8 or even more dimensions that are impacting how you might behave and decisions you might make individually, think about how much more complex that is when that gets compounded into a board setting. I also wanted to tie it into the concepts of fraud. And if anyone has studied fraud, because we're going to come back around that again in a little bit, there are 5 conditions that need to exist, generally speaking, for a fraud and for a fraudster to want to commit a fraud. And these all have a parallel into ethical decisions that a board would make. Motivation. So is there motivation? Perhaps you need money for personal healthcare need or something like that. But in a business context, the motivation would be different. The opportunity has to present itself. You need an ability to reason and rationalize your behavior. That's a human characteristic, right? You're going to balance the likelihood of being caught with the consequences of being caught. So that's, if anyone, like say, if you study fraud, those are really the thought process you go through when you think about the situation of fraudsters. And when you think about your role as an individual in your executive role or as a member of the board, think about those same dimensions, right? What's motivating a behavior? What's motivating a decision? What opportunity has been presented? How do you reason or rationalize the decision that you're going to make? What's the likelihood of getting caught? And what's the consequences of being caught? So when it comes to ethical decisions in a corporate setting, you know, the consequences of getting caught, I guess the consequences of being deemed to exhibit unethical behavior, um, lack of trust, financial results, you know, financial mismanagement, negative impacts from the action that you took, and perhaps even criminal charges if it's tied to illegal activity. And we're going to go through some examples that are going. I can show you that the consequence of failure of the ethics decision had one or more of those results, right? So that's why I want to start, I guess, with a lens on ethical decision making. The issue with the board is that, you know, now we talk about diversity of a board, bringing more people together from different backgrounds. And again, we just talked about the fact that people um, already have complex personal decision making relative to all those influences in their life. So when you bring that together in a group, when you might not have similarity of cultural norms or age or gender, etc., it just again creates that framework for even more complex considerations in making the ethical decisions. We're also going to talk about stakeholder interests, and you know, in the majority of cases, there's a conflict of stakeholder influences. So you don't even have stakeholder interests aligned. So throw that into the mix in terms of complications. So that's what I want to say, Jamie, in terms of just kind of kicking us off. Maybe we could just turn to some of the questions that we were considering.
Awesome. So the first question we thought would be worthwhile having a chat about is how do we define the role of board governance ensuring ethical practices within an organization? So how is if you're on a board, what is your role when it comes to ethical practices for that organization?
So there's a legal duty of care, and in Canada, that's still a duty to the corporation. So the decision process should always anchor back to that. It's becoming a little bit more complicated because even like in Canada this year, you might be familiar with the new TSX guidelines around engaging broader stakeholder perspective. So then we could talk a little bit more about that if you like, but you know, so now you're trying to balance this duty to the corporation with a broader expectation or an expectation of a broader consideration of a wider stakeholder group. So, you know, again, the shareholder, the director is in that situation of having to have that lens on all of the ethical decisions that they might be confronted with.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, how do you feel that differs from, or maybe a good example would be if someone's the chair of the board, but also the CEO, you know, their role in ethical practices, does it differ in the CEO seat than it does in the chair, right? Potentially.
Absolutely. So I want to build on that in two respects. One is we can talk about the different types of boards, which I think I covered in my previous time with you. So is it different if it's an advisory board, you know, than a governance board? And if it's an advisory board and the shareholder and the CEO are the same person, or the chair of the board is the CEO, maybe the chair of the board is the CEO and the shareholder. All of those situations exist.
Right.
They all put the board into different situations, I guess, as they deal with ethical dilemmas. So, I mean, I'll introduce one of the examples that I was going to talk to. There is a First Nations business here in Alberta where the board recently all resigned, like 100% of the board resigned. The reason they resigned, as I understand it, I mean, there's only limited information available, but the controlling shareholder was also chair of the board and was making decisions contrary to the recommendations of the board, right? So that puts the board in an awkward spot. I mean, on the one hand, they're entrusted with this governance and oversight responsibility, yet they don't control the actions that take place, you know, in the business, and effectively their guidance and their recommendations gets overridden by the shareholder, right? And in some of those circumstances where the shareholder is also the CEO, and a board member or chair of the board, that can really become complicated for the board. And that's an extreme example where the board is left with really only one action, like to resign. That's not a good place to be.
No, for sure. And then how does that help the organization overall if they have no board left, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That took place here in Alberta, so I can tell you that.
Let's talk about some other common ethical dilemmas and some other stories.
Sure, I thought what I'd do, this is the one time I'm gonna try to share my screen. And I thought we would just talk through, yeah, can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
I'll try to, I'll just scroll down as I need to. And these overlap a little bit, and but each of the examples that we're going to talk about, like I say, involves one or the other of these. And this little cheat sheet we can make available after if you like. So conflict of interest, that's a fairly common one. I think most people would understand, where a board member has a personal or financial interest that could influence their decision making. We see this sometimes as well in boards, like it might be, and I'm just going to generalize, it might be a private equity backed organization, it could be a government board or government agency or commission, where board members actually are appointed to be a representative of their group. There might be a representative of an industry association or something like that. And they can't help but bring an accountability or what I call a constituent interest to bear. And it's really hard for them to leave that at the door. Like when you get into the board setting and you have the broader duty to the corporation, you really shouldn't be influenced by your constituent interest. So easier said than done, but that's a very common situation. Most other types of conflict of interest can be managed. Like transparency was a word that came up and probably come up here again. But if a board member discloses the conflict, maybe they, if it's significant enough, maybe they abstain from voting. If it's a contract, maybe they're going to be awarded the contract or something like that. We have a board member in the board that I chair that's in a same or similar business as ours. And we know that that's actually one of the values that he brings to the board, is that he brings that perspective of the business. But we do acknowledge it as a conflict of interest, right? Because confidentiality, he's getting access to information that he could use, and vice versa. He shares things with us, right? So that's an easy one to manage, I would say. Executive compensation is an interesting one. On the one hand, you want to expect that your executive team are making the right decisions, and we talked about bringing that ethical lens to doing what making the decision that you think would be the ethical decision. For them to do that when it might have a personal implication to them, perhaps relative to bonus or incentive or at-risk pay, because if they made a decision differently, maybe profits would be higher. So, the board wants to make sure that, that they're reconciling the ethical decisions that they would want to see their management team make with the consequences that has to the individual, and ultimately fairness should prevail if the board is truly, standing behind their ethical standards, right? So that's a tricky one. You get to the end of the year, bonus thresholds haven't been met, but some very difficult decisions were made by the executive team during the year. The board still has the decision to weigh in on evaluating performance and pay for performance, right? Whistleblower, having a whistleblower policy, but then also, having the process in place to properly escalate. Not everything needs to come, to the board, but there should be a process to escalate, and the board should have access to the whistleblower. So again, in the case of the board that I chair, I've got access to our whistleblower data. I make a point of going in every month just to check, and it's actually, to be honest, it's a good thing when you see something in there, because often they're, I wouldn't say minor issues, but they're issues that can be properly addressed through the management channels. If you don't see anything in there, then you kind of wonder, is the policy being understood or utilized, or maybe there's not a culture that's actually encouraging the use of the whistleblower. So again, the board has a role to play there, and how they deal with the issues that do come forward. Corporate social responsibility, we've been living in Alberta, we're all quite familiar with this one. So addressing social and environmental impact while maintaining profitability. So there's, insider trading is an interesting one. And particularly also, not so much even insider trading, but sometimes having foresight knowledge of results, which often, senior executives have that visibility. So it's kind of akin to insider trading if you're using that for personal advantage. And another interesting one I just came across this week actually was customers in your supply, not in your supply chain, customers that you supply can be a bellwether to you. And that's, in terms of business planning, that's an appropriate thing. So if all of a sudden orders are being cut or orders are being delayed, let's say you're, providing drilling equipment, and all of a sudden your top customer just doesn't need the equipment anymore. That's equivalent to insider trading. I mean, you're getting knowledge that's not generally available in the marketplace, and if you use that to trade for personal, or to use that for personal business decisions, and I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying, are these ethical dilemmas or not, right? So it's kind of the canary in the coal mine there, and that's an interesting one, I think.
For sure.
Risk management, just generally speaking, having to balance all business decisions, mitigating risks and respecting stakeholder rights, which is the next one. We talked about, the benefits, I guess, of diverse and inclusive board and management teams, but also, being aware of that there's different, like I said before, like there's different cultural, social norms and other drivers that you need to manage in order to make ethical decisions that you believe are fully representative of all the different views of this diverse group that you've brought together. Data privacy, again, more and more in the news because of AI, and we can talk about that, generative AI, and what happens when you start putting data up into, broadly into the cloud. Product safety, that's an ethical issue, address issues about safety and quality of products and services. So, do you cut corners for profitability's sake if it means, potentially putting consumers at risk? Environmental impact, again, we talked about that one up above. Regulatory compliance, interesting new compliance around the New Slavery Act and regulations to report on supply chain in Canada. That's an example there, but obviously, we're in a highly regulated industry in most energy production, and so there's an example there where the board has a responsibility to ensure that compliance is taking place, right? Which again ties into good governance. Is the board exercising all the best leading practices of good governance? I mentioned the TSX report and some of the stuff I would have talked about maybe when I came on last time, Jamie, around what does a high performing board look like, and what processes do they put in place to ensure that there's some confidence, I guess, in how ethical decisions are being made in the organization, and accepting that as a board level responsibility. M&A is an interesting one as well. I've seen examples in my past where you have to really look at what's the motivation for the deal. Sometimes it's ego, and maybe it's not in the best interest of the stakeholders. And oftentimes there's this concept of kind of falling in love with the deal, or get the deal done at any cost, right? And everyone wants to be associated with something that maybe makes it's newsworthy and it becomes really cool. But at some point, you got to continuously use that lens to say, is this in the best interest of the corporation, right? Crisis management, an interesting one, like responding to, crises, and a couple of the examples I'll talk to are that, things that might come up like a product defect, and then how do you react, how do you respond, to do the right thing, I guess, right? So, and I'm sure there's more. This is the list that I put together. So.
Yeah, there's certainly a few dilemmas that a board member could face, and it'll be great to hear some examples of some of them. I know we talked about how there's no shortage of ethical examples right in the media and the news, but there's a difference between an ethical dilemma and maybe just a bad business decision too. So I know we'll get into that a bit, because not every bad business decision was an ethical dilemma to begin with, or an ethical issue in terms of it being a mistake or an error or what have you, right? So there is a difference there, and sometimes people can try and box every bad decision into an ethics question, which is not actually the case. So maybe we could chat a few of your personal or other examples.
Sure, and I've got a lot of them here, so I'll do a few, and we can pause and see if you want me to keep going.
Sure.
I can be quick on them, but they're all. What's interesting is we look at that list of 15 items or so there, and they all come up in one way or other in these examples. And to your point, they might not all necessarily tie back to an ethical decision. I would guess in most cases they do. Although again, it's not maybe not always that apparent. But a couple years ago, there was I guess a few years ago now, there was a CEO in Vancouver. He was the CEO of a tech company in Vancouver who was dog sitting for a friend of his, and was caught on camera, actually in the elevator. It was an elevator camera, kicking the dog, and it became public. Not sure how. Somebody reviewed the elevator video, but it did become public. And obviously the CEO was, remorseful and tried to explain his way out of it as to what happened, and the board stood behind him initially, and then within a short matter of time, had to agree to let the CEO go. So there's an example of. And what I want to ask around the personal ethics is, do your answers change when nobody's looking, right? And that's kind of that internal compass that you have around ethics, right? But this guy apparently, good standing in the business community. The business was doing well, and so what he did personally certainly impacted the business, and the board had to act. Similarly, in Canmore, and you might be familiar with this example.
Well, maybe let's just pause for 1 second on that story, because what's interesting there is obviously dogs and animals have like a very special place in people's hearts, and people think black and white sometimes when it comes to dogs and animals, and very quickly make a decision as to what's ethical and what's not ethical. But it's interesting because if we think about some of the most famous businessmen and CEOs in the world, I mean, they're often notoriously horrible husbands, horrible fathers, horrible friends. I would argue maybe being a horrible husband is arguably worse than kicking a dog once in an elevator. I don't know though, maybe not. But do you know what I mean? It's kind of interesting that you see some of the richest men in the world are very, very bad fathers and husbands, and that's pretty much like well known. So it's very interesting to think about that ethicals, and then if you extrapolate that even further in terms of artists, I mean, how many artists are just convicted criminals, and yet we continue to support them because they have an expertise in their art, and maybe the CEO had an expertise in his business. So it's a very interesting discussion in terms of what you do personally and then how that affects your role in business, right?
Yeah, and the fact that it became public, so you almost wonder, it's back to my question around, do you behave differently if nobody's watching? Would the organization have behaved differently if nobody was watching? So, maybe they would have reprimanded the CEO, but like, hey, let's just keep this between ourselves, right? Which leads
Right.
me to the Hockey Canada example. I wanted to use that one, right? So, everyone's aware now of the sexual assault allegations, the investigation, and now there's criminal charges in one case anyway. But the one case that the board agreed to settle on, and they paid millions of dollars to settle civilly, um, there's, the implication of that is that they were wanting to keep it quiet and not be public, right? Um, and then when it became public, obviously, it led to, a very difficult situation for the board to try to explain why that was the right decision that they had to make. Ultimately, it led to, all of the board being turned over, right? So there's an example again of something that, they made a decision when something wasn't public, and then once it's public, they like to go back and, now you have to justify the decision that was made, right? So,
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that. You were going to mention a Canmore example, and then I cut you off. So I
well,
think I
sorry.
know where you're going, but let's get that
Yeah.
one.
So the Canmore example was, it was one of, I believe he was one of the founders or one of the owners, certainly one part of the management team of a local Canmore business there, a caterer, a catering bakery business, who publicly ranted transphobic remarks. And so again, once you're, you've represented a point of view in the public that was not well received in the community. The obviously led to dismissal. So again, there's an example where if you want to, as an organization, say these are the values, because I think values. I think someone used the word values when we asked that, but integrity, values. If these are standards that the organization believes in and wants to uphold, and then you've got public representation. Now, what's interesting, and this happened with, I think it was one of the McCains as well, when they argued, well, that's on my personal Instagram or whatever, right? Like I'm not representing the company. So that's a whole other issue because you are you are a representative of your company. And certainly at the more senior levels, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice on that. But I can tell you the CEO contract that we put in place for the board that I chair unequivocally has clauses for termination in there for behavior that's considered to be, inappropriate and unethical, et cetera. And I'm sure there's definitions in there as to what that means, right? So the more senior you are in the organization, the more you do have that you do represent your organization. And there's, again, I'm not giving employment law advice here, but there's likely you wouldn't be long to stay with the organization if you're found publicly to be in a situation where the values that you exhibit are not consistent with the values of the organization, right?
Yeah, and I mean that particular example is interesting because it's a family-run business. So my understanding of that situation is the termination of one person who still is like financially benefiting from the business had little to no impact on saving their brand or helping their brand. And the reality is each and every vendor that they worked with was faced with their own ethical decision. And I suspect that for those vendors that had boards, that decision was at the board level as to whether or not to continue to work with them and have their product on the shelves. And that's, I mean, it's an interesting question because if the product is demanded by your customers, that would obviously be something that you're considering. If the product is of high quality standards, if the product's not easily replaceable, which that product, I'm not exactly sure how replaceable it would be, but in terms of it being local and of a certain level of quality, et cetera, I'm not sure that it was easily replaceable product because it was local and of a high standard quality. I don't think there was like 10 other Albertan producers at the same level of quality standards, et cetera. So, there's a lot of things you have to think about in addition to this blow up, of which, you know, some of those vendors maybe have never asked themselves what their views of transgender or this conversation is. Like, that might not even been on their values. They might just have never even addressed the question, right? So not an easy, I mean, I would imagine there was multiple boards struggling with some ethical dilemmas when it came to that particular circumstance. And I think some pulled off pretty fast, some pulled off eventually, and arguably the ones that took longer could have been a more of a consumer demand response as opposed to an ethical board decision. And then others, I mean, I believe some people obviously still carry that product as far as I know.
Yeah, and you touched on two things here, Jamie. One is absolutely, and that is the example we're talking about today, is like the board's role in making that decision. Like, we're going to stop using that supplier. The other is the implication of the issue to the business itself, because they go hand in hand. But they lost a lot of their major accounts, right? So when I talk about the consequences of an ethical, I'll call it a failure, in that case was quite significant, I believe. Again, only just going from what was in the public. But another recent example, obviously in Alberta, similar kind of topic, I guess, is the government policy now, and the gender policy that came out a couple of months ago. I saw several organizations publicly state their position on that. I would hope, and I did validate this in one case, that as they make their response to that public, that they've gone through their board to make sure that that is the position that the board wants to take. And again, I'm not here making ethical judgments on right or wrong, but when you're making, particularly like you get into these big public hot button items, if you're going to represent a point of view for your organization on a matter like that, and you're going to do it publicly, you better make sure that's the point of view that the board supports. So.
Yeah, and and even from a tone at the top, fair enough if the person that's putting that information out ultimately gets the final vote and everyone else has to toe the line. But you better be communicating the information appropriately within the company so that they do toe that party line. And we have had clients in circumstances like this where an activist statement was made from a marketing department, and people on the executive and the board and what have you were not aware that this statement was going out until they randomly saw it on their Instagram. And meanwhile, they're getting peppered with questions and asked about it, and they didn't even know it was out there, let alone what the appropriate response was and what the tone of the top was. And certainly, if a company decides to be an activist company, the expectation is that everybody falls in line and sings the same tune. And step number one is knowing what that tune is. Otherwise, how do you support it or present yourself as being behind it? And it's complicated in today's world. And I know, not to ramble on, but just to quickly bring it home a bit, Amplify, like Jesse and I made the decision, we call it our Dolly Parton and our Michael Jordan approach, which I won't get into the details, but basically we don't have an activist perspective at Amplify because we have all kinds of people here, all kinds of clients. I mean, there's the conspiracy theorist on one end, there's the woke person on the other end, and we can serve all of them with financial strategy. And so we try to stay out of all activist conversations. Maybe sometimes we'll go a little harder on growth businesses and small, medium business, because that's something that doesn't offend and is really what we sell and serve. But by and large, we don't get into anything. But each individual has the right to have their opinions and potentially post about their opinions, but Amplify as a whole doesn't get into these things. And I will tell you that we have had people that don't agree. Like, there is the view that silence is violence. And there are people who ethically think that by not going out there and supporting women or supporting so-and-so or supporting whatever cause, that we are acting without ethics. Yeah. And they have a right to that point of view, and they don't want to work here because we're not in front of these issues. And that's a hard decision that Jesse and I had to make, because there are consequences to our decision not to be an activist company. And there are people who think silence is violence and we're unethical because we don't get ahead and use our voice.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads right into the concept I mentioned earlier, just around how complicated this gets when you have that broader group of stakeholders to consider, right? How do your employees expect you to respond? How do your customers expect you to respond, right? And then you've got shareholders who, want to make a financial return. And so you've got all this in the balance, right? And you make the decision as a board that you think is the right decision for the business. Maybe that was to not be public because you're making a decision to say, look, we're we're not saying we condone the action or the position that someone's taken. We don't need to weigh in, right? But then, yeah, did you leave your employees hanging? Like, oh, I expect our organization to take an opportunity to use their voice, right? So it's complicated. Which leads me to another example, and you mentioned it when we were chatting, like the open AI example. Really interesting when you start to think about how powerful the influence of stakeholders. So, like in that case, and where the CEO gets fired by the board, and I went to see what I could find, and here was the quote from the board's perspective: Sam Altman was fired for not being consistently candid in his communications with the board, thereby hindering the board's ability to exercise its responsibilities. So I would read that as a board member and say, man, it sounds like a good cause to me to right? Like, how can the board execute on its governance responsibilities when you've got a CEO who, in their words, is not consistently being candid in his communications with the board, right? So, right? So you think, oh, the board made the right decision, what they believe to be the right decision in the best interest of the corporation. What happened? All the employees the employees quit. They threatened to quit, and all of them, because they stood behind their CEO. And Microsoft at the same time made an offer to take all the employees over to Microsoft in this battle between Copilot and OpenAI, right? Microsoft, man, you guys come over here. We'll support you. Like, we share your values and what have you, right? So fast forward, now the CEO is back and they've got a new board in place, right?
Yeah, so, and this one's super interesting because one would assume that no board would fire a CEO and maybe especially a founder CEO without a lot of diligence and consideration. I mean, we have to assume and give them credit that happened because that's a big deal, right? It's not going to happen because you're having a little tantrum and you're upset one day, right? It's going to be a lot more thorough of a decision. And then meanwhile, there's the stakeholder considerations. And so we want to talk about how you balance the interests of various stakeholders while upholding ethical standards. And the interesting thing about this example is, I mean, to some degree, could you suggest that, Microsoft owns a pretty big portion of OpenAI. They're a massive partner. Should a decision like that be made without some kind of consultation with Microsoft, or is consulting with Microsoft breaking trust and confidentiality? I don't know the answer, but clearly they didn't consult or fully understand their partner and investors' response. They did not anticipate it correctly, given, I believe Microsoft also offered the CEO a job too, not just employees. So clearly Microsoft was not in line. So whether or not they should have been formally consulted or at least appropriately considered, there was a business, maybe not an ethical failure, but certainly a business failure by the board in that regard. And then top that off with employees. Now, obviously, a board's not going to be able to poll an employee base of like, hey, would you all quit if we fired this guy? Like, I don't know how you get the tone of the employees, as in regards to the specific decision, but it goes without doubt that this board was not in tune with their employee base. And at the end of the day, business is people. And if you're not in tune with your people, are you even in tune with your business?
Yeah. No, absolutely, Jamie. So that's where you think about what are some of the steps that the organization could take to prevent those types of situations. Because that was such a binary situation. So I mean, that's really kind of an extreme. But if you think as an annual process, like in addition to an engagement survey, a lot of our organizations are doing culture surveys. And a culture survey is different than an engagement survey because the questions get more around, the organization living its values and colleagues living their values and things like that. And, as good as any survey is, at least it's a pulse check. It's a barometer. You're getting some feedback that says, yeah, I'm proud to work for this organization. I believe our organization makes ethical decisions or makes decisions and acts in a way consistent with our values, right? So those are questions that come out of a culture survey. And so again, from a board responsibility, a board should be ensuring that they are measuring and monitoring culture in their organization. That's a core responsibility of the board. The other way to do it with stakeholders, and it is tricky. It's hard to do it in the moment. You can't really, particularly your broad stakeholders, you can't call them up and say, "Hey, CEO kicked the dog. Like, what are we gonna?" And that might not be practical. And there's legal issues as well. There's a legal framework around what you can disclose and when and to who. But you can pre-plan. So another emerging practice for boards is to actually do some role playing, scenario planning, so that you can tease out from the board how they would respond to certain types of situations, and at least create some, like, it's all about having a framework or an ethics framework in place. The other thing you can do as well is you can validate the expectations of the shareholders on regular points in time. So we call it just having the voice of the shareholder. But again, you don't necessarily do it in the moment when you need a judgment, but you do it as a continuous process to just revalidate what are their expectations, their alignment to the organizational values, et cetera, et cetera. And at least you've got that as kind of background, right?
So what I'm hearing from a practical example is that if I'm on a board, we should have some kind of practices, whether it be surveys or those questions you just mentioned with shareholders or what have you, right? Some type of data points that makes us feel that we understand our stakeholders at any given time. So, there's many ways to get a pulse of your stakeholders, but as a board, you should know where you have risk with stakeholders and what their overall perception is of how we're living values or meeting the expectations of our relationship or what have you. And if you're a board and you're in the dark when it comes to material and important stakeholder perceptions and interactions, then potentially, come an ethical dilemma, you're not the best person to help make the decision and guide that organization.
Absolutely. So again, remember the relationship goes from shareholder to board to management. So if the board's in the dark, then what's guiding management activities, right? So it's really incumbent on the board to really truly understand those expectations, to curate and consciously oversee the development of a culture that aligns to that, and ensure that that's the standard that management's being held to, right? So this kind of goes down in that level. You touched on it earlier, though, and just another example I want to bring up was when you've got and particularly in the U.S. model where the CEO is often chair of the board. I think that does create more complications. Like I do like our model in Canada where that's rarely the practice. Certainly in public companies, it's not the practice, but you might see it more in private company. But in a public company where you've got that dual hat, that can really get complicated. And then again, you go into different jurisdictions. So I want to bring up, because it's today's news, everyone would have seen what came out of the Evergrande in China. I mean, $78 billion revenue overstatement. Like basically the entire revenue book for 2 years was being fraudulently stated, $78 billion. The CEO was also vice chair of the board, and 6 executives were found also being directly responsible. So that's, you have to imply in that situation that there's unethical behavior, right? That's been allowed to exist. Where was the board, right? Well, when the CEO is the executive chair of the board, who's challenging Is the board really doing their job, right? Is there really a effective governance function in place? I was gonna, before that one, I was gonna use the old BRIEX example, because the same thing, that's one of Canada's famous cases for, misstating revenue, right, based on fraudulent sample results, et cetera, right? But this Evergrande one just blows that out of the water. $78 billion revenue misstatement, so.
Yeah, that is a lot. So how can what are some mechanisms that boards can put in place to promote transparency and accountability in their board decision-making processes? So if you're on a board and you want to make sure that there's transparency and accountability, and obviously that would, in turn lower your liability, I would assume. What are some good ideas that a board could have to help them?
Yeah, so it's not one thing. So, I talked about, so transparency is, as a board, a good practice is to have governing principles for the board. And those are really just rules of engagement of the board. Treat each other honestly with respect, speak openly, agreeable disagreement, etc. But you have to foster a culture at the board for real legitimate and authentic discussion. So that's the culture of the board. And then the board's duty, like I talked before about everything from like purpose, like there's our purpose statement well understood. Is does it align to the shareholder? Is it understood by our employees, right? So then I mentioned about the culture surveys. There's things you can do down at the staff level. Having a whistleblower line, I mean, that's kind of an after the fact check, that somebody can have a means and a mechanism at least to reach out appropriately if they feel like there's a behavior that's inconsistent with the values of the organization. Yeah, I think it's really it's a combination of all those factors, really, Jamie, like where trust, mutual respect, alignment to purpose, but keeping the dialogue alive, legitimizing the conversation. If we've got conflict of interest and everyone would, conflict of interest as a standing agenda item, for example. So you call for any other disclosure of conflicts. I mean, there's things you can do as a process step, but it's really the fabric of the organization. That's really what culture is, the behaviors and how people show up, that, the board has a duty to measure and monitor.
I think I liked how you alluded to, conflicts of interest. Sometimes people see that and they're like, oh, conflict of interest, like we have to get rid of the conflict, right? Or I can't be part of a board because of the conflict of interest or what have you. That's sort of the easy go-to answer that some people's brains or experience would lead them to. But I like the way you alluded to the fact that a conflict of interest doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. It's just a challenge that has risk that has to be mitigated. And that in many cases, it's two sides of the same coin, like so many things, right? It's the very conflict of interest that could actually bring value to the company. And I think that's really important to think about. I mean, if we think about, for example, like I'm on an NPO board and there's an opportunity to use one of the volunteer board members' businesses in order to, as a service that we need to buy. And so clearly that's a conflict of interest. And so some people would go very black and white and be like, we can't buy from them because it's a conflict of interest. So therefore they're not an eligible vendor, or the board member would have to quit. But I kind of look at it like, if we're transparent and we have risk mitigation process and policy in place, why wouldn't we want that person's company to serve us when, as far as I'm concerned, they're going to have a heightened reason to do a great job. Absolutely. And it's gonna be like every dollar we could be getting, 1.2 worth of value because they have a lot more reason to serve us well. So, I see the conflict of interest. Undoubtedly, I see the conflict of interest, but I also see it as an opportunity, and the risk of the conflict can be mitigated. But I do sometimes find myself in conversations with people where it's like conflict of interest must be solved, can't use vendor, or can't have that person in the decision making or on the board at all. And to your point, one of the other ways to mitigate the risk is if you're doing if that particular service was an RFP, okay, that board member doesn't participate in the final vote or the interviews or the assessment of the vendors. Like, there's many ways to do it other than the black and white cut off the conflict. So I'd love for you to expand a bit about that, or maybe give another example, because I think you alluded to it and it's not necessarily where people's head goes.
So I agree with you, and I know several examples again from my not-for-profit life. So a board member that does video production, for example, that's what his company does. And the nonprofit agency does a lot of video production because they use it for promotional purposes, the donor relations, et cetera, et cetera. So why not use the friendly person that's on our board, right? As long as we feel confident that the quality is the same, the pricing is the same. So you might have to do some diligence around that. So that's one example. Or catering is another example. Like, you know, somebody's family member, or there's another relationship with a caterer or something. That's great until and if there becomes an issue or a problem, which, you know, if there's a delivery issue, because I've seen it go the other way where they take advantage of the situation. And I heard what you're saying, like, no, you expect them to go over and beyond. And I've seen examples where they take it for granted, you know, that this is their business. And when there are quality issues, that just becomes a challenge, and you have to deal with it openly and honestly, right? Like you would with any vendor, but it becomes a little bit more awkward when it's a board member that has that conflict. So it goes both ways. Yeah, really what you're comfortable with. We make a point, this my wife and I here at home personally, you know, we have lots of friends who will offer to do so. Oh, I'll do that landscaping for you. Nope. Like, I'd rather pay more, and if I have issues, I can go deal with them. Like, it's hard to deal with the brother-in-law who doesn't do the job that you want, right? And it's kind of that same concept with when you're dealing with someone in a related party sense. So you can do it, and it can be managed, but you have to be prepared for the consequences, which are both favorable and unfavorable at times.
Yeah, and I think you bring a good point. You have to know what you're willing to do or what you can accept, right? And so if you're a person who wants to avoid that conflict and doesn't want to have that hard conversation if the worst situation happens, then you need to know that about yourself or your executive team or your organization or what have you, right? Versus other people are prepared to have those and have a history of successfully navigating that, right? I mean, I've hired many friends and they don't all work for me anymore. And some of them, and I still hang out with them, and they know they wouldn't get a job again. Right.
And I'd say materiality matters, and we're going off topic a little bit, but you know, catering contract is one thing. You know, a major business relationship is another thing, right? We're now, you know, the quality and delivery standards are really more have a greater impact on the business. Then it might be in that board member's interest to resign.
Yeah, no, for sure. So obviously we're at 10 after, we've got 20 more minutes. If people have questions, make sure you get them typed out now so that we get a chance to hit them. We're also going to look at a few dilemmas that we'll be sharing with you after. We'll do that at the very end of this conversation. So we're certainly not going to hit all the questions that I would have loved to ask you or hear all the examples that are exciting and interesting. But I want to talk about diversity and inclusion. So obviously, boards are hyper-focused on diversity and inclusion. It's of great importance to the composition. We know that certain public companies are required to have a certain level of diversity and inclusion in order to be listed in certain, and of course, there's situations where if the board's not showing diversity and inclusion appropriately, they aren't considered a supplier of other business partners. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why diversity and inclusion is very practically a must think about, if not a must do for a board. But when we're talking about ethical governance, how does that tie and how does that relate? You alluded to it a bit at your intro where, you know, my perception of ethics may be different because I'm a Canadian born female. So, but let's talk a bit more about that. And if you have any examples, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, maybe I guess I would start with, again, what we believe in is proper design of the board. So, you know, you really want to make sure that you've curated your board with the diversity objective in mind, but that you haven't compromised the types of skills, behaviors that that you would expect to have of your board members. So it's not diversity for diversity's sake, and I think there's been a lot, written and said about that. So assuming that you've got diverse candidates, that's still, like when we do our work at Ozone, we talk about mindsets and capabilities, so that you really know what they're bringing to the table. You want their diverse voice, so I think it's important for all board members, and particularly the board chair, to make sure that they're gaining the benefit of that diverse perspective. Again, culturally, people can behave differently, and some people from different cultures need to be drawn out more. So that's a board chair responsibility to really make sure that you're hearing all those voices. Um, but yeah, but the other thing is, we talked about it before, like you want the conversation to be robust. You want those different perspectives to come to play. You need to have some guiding values and guiding principles. So what one board member might think is totally fine, and maybe that's and I don't mean it to be flippant in saying that, like maybe it's a cultural difference to say, well, I don't see why you guys are so worried about that. Like where I come from, or in my experience, this wouldn't be an issue. You just have to make sure that you balance that with whatever the values and ethical standards that you set for your own organization are, right? So it might be it's a compromise to that one board member, or they might have thought or acted differently if they were on their own, or maybe the board shifts, pivots, and says, you know what, I think you've got something there. That's an interesting perspective. Maybe the reason that you have that from your experience is that we're looking at this differently. Maybe there's a way we can influence and change our thinking around the matter, right? So back to authenticity, transparency, authentic conversation. These are not, I think you've seen in these examples, well, I shouldn't say they're not all right and wrong. I think the consequences often tend to be wrong, but a lot of ethical decisions are not necessarily right or wrong. But you have a process and you're making conscious decisions, I guess is probably the most important thing. Right?
Yeah, no, for sure. How should boards respond to instances of ethical misconduct or breaches within their organization? I think this is an interesting one. We talked about it a bit in our prep discussion of like, should, if there's a situation of an ethical dilemma, does that mean that someone needs to be fired? Actually, the dog example is another good example. Like, does it always mean that you need a turnover of executive or board? Is there a way to manage the situation internally? Like, what are some good responses you've seen from boards, and what are some that haven't seemed to be successful for them?
Yeah, certainly, a senior executive figure that's brought public disrepute or shame or whatever to an organization most likely will be dealt with in dismissal, and that's some of the examples that we gave. But I think other times there could be course correction. So again, I to use the word materiality because we're talking ethics, but there might be examples of behaviors that you can course correct by just providing feedback, saying, yeah, we would have thought that the decision would have been different if you had been applying, value statements. So help us understand. And that's why I say if they're maybe less material, because particularly when you have a new management team, or say you got a new CEO, then you really want to be checking in on that decision-making framework quite regularly at the outset, just to make sure. That's why I like doing this role modeling or scenario planning, and that type of exercise is good as well. The whistleblower type, having a whistleblower process, if somebody's acted inappropriately, I mean, absent it being a criminal act, if it's a clear breach of the values that you have in place as an organization, then you need to have a mechanism to deal with that. And then you're into human resource management, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you fire the person. You might say, I'm not sure, I'm not sure if you're aware how your behavior is impacting other people. Like there's, that type of conversation, right? So again, I'm not an HR manager, but there are ways of trying to coach and counsel people that you believe have acted inappropriately. or made a decision that they might have, if they thought differently or aligned it against the corporate values as opposed to their own values, they might have made a different decision. And you know, you can coach and counsel folks like that. I always think about when I was a partner at EY, when it came, the first year I was a partner, and it came to like my expense report as a partner. And the advice I got from our CEO at the time was, we have a fair degree of latitude and we trust our partners. Here's the standard I would expect you to be held to. Pretend we're at an annual partner conference and we're going to randomly select 10 partners' expense reports and put them up on the screen so your partners can judge. Like, if you'd be worried about your name being pulled, then that's a guideline for you, right? I kind of thought that was an interesting example, right? Where you kind of have to use your own internal compass a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting example for sure, because there's differences in what people think is right and wrong when it comes to something as simple as expense reports, for sure. So, and that may not be a case of fully firing someone or making an example of them. And to your point, materiality seems a bit odd sometimes to think about when it comes to ethical decision making, but it does potentially have a place. I mean,
yeah, if it's a small misstep as opposed to something that's a large misstep, right? So
yeah,
the bigger the misstep, the bigger the inference that you're not aligned to our organizational values, I would say.
right. Definitely. So earlier you were talking about the soccer example. I'd love to hear that one actually, because I'm not familiar with it. So let's dig into that one quickly.
Yeah, and again, I don't have a lot to go on from what's on the public record, but it's an interesting case where the Canadian Soccer Players Association, which is effectively the union for their Canadian soccer players, has sued Canada Soccer, so the national body. They sued them for $40 million for failure to act in the best interests of the organization, basically, is the premise of the lawsuit. And it ties to a contractual agreement that Canada Soccer entered into to outsource. Effectively, they sold their marketing and sponsorship rights to a third-party organization. And the players who are directly affected by that decision, because they're used in promoting and marketing and sponsoring Canada Soccer, believe that that decision was not in the best interests of the corporation of Canada Soccer. So, you know, hard to tell. Like, is that an ethical decision, or is it a bad, like you said earlier, Jamie? Like, is that a bad business decision? There's some hint of impropriety. So whether the organization that they sold these marketing and sponsorship rights to had some connection or affiliation, you know, with board members, or had some opportunity for gain. I think there's some implication that there could be something further to it like that. So I'm not sure exactly what's got the Players Association so upset about this, but obviously they feel like they certainly, as a stakeholder group, don't feel like they were represented in that decision, right?
Right.
So that ties back to a Canada Soccer board decision framework, right? Like, how was that decision made? And I'd like to think that the soccer board would say, well, look, we understand here's our stakeholder agenda. Like, we understand what the needs of the stakeholders are, what the expectations of the stakeholders are. This is our mandate as a Canada Soccer board. This is why we believe that decision was made in the best interest of the company. I mean, I'd like to think that I don't think they willy-nilly made this decision, right? But again, it's a great example of how decisions that impact significantly on other stakeholder groups get called into question, right? So that board, you know, I don't know if it's a volunteer board. I presume it is, and the board members themselves are being sued. So
Yeah, and so at minimum, there's a lack of transparency on that decision making, right? Because the stakeholders aren't understanding it and or didn't know about it in a timely manner. So,
you can go further, like I'm a big golf fan, I mean PGA and the Live Tour and this whole debacle, like the PGA Tour members weren't aware that this whole potential demerger was taking place, right? So what understanding or consultation was there with the members, right, with the professional golfers themselves, right? So it's a fine line. They say, well, again, we don't have a duty, we have a duty to confidentiality. We didn't, we have legal advice as to when to share what and what's appropriate to share when. And so the answers to those questions are going to be different every time and every different situation. The board's role is to make sure that those questions are being asked. Again, it's back to, consciousness and transparency and accountability in the decision-making framework that they use, right?
yeah, for sure. That's an interesting one. So when we think about boards, like making sure that they're practicing ethically, we talked a bit about surveys, we talked a bit about role playing. Is there any other like audits or assessments that a board could use to help improve their governance and make sure that they're prepared for an ethical dilemma should it come to their door?
No, I don't have any others that come to mind, to be honest, Jamie. Like, I really think if you've got the culture set at the board that open and honest discussions can take place. You provide space for agreeable disagreement. You believe in that you manifest the culture that you want of the organization. You can demonstrate a thought process because this is, largely this is a risk assessment exercise, right? So you can demonstrate that, the consequences, good and bad, of the decision have been thoroughly thought out. And again, it's not the board's job necessarily to do that. It's the board's job to make sure that that's the work that's been done by management and that the board's asking the right questions. So again, we talked about this the last time I joined you, but the role of the board is to ask good questions. And I think if the board is asking the right questions, following, again, consistently with their values, you've done what you can do.
And I think it's important, a strong organization, you've mentioned it numerous times here, a strong organization has defined values, and that's not just words on a wall, but that's values that people actually understand what they mean, what they look like, how they show up. And so I think we know that values are important for retention, for recruiting, for strategy, for growth. And this is just, another case for strong, understood, and practice values within an organization, because it can be the framework of decision making and the framework of what's considered ethical. So I love that it comes down to, something as basic, but yet often not practiced consistently and disciplined throughout an organization. So I think that's really important. And documenting those is critical. I mean, we have to remember documenting how you make decision makings and the framework you use can protect the board members. And I think, if you have those values clearly documented, clearly communicated, and then big decisions, you're working within that framework and documenting and asking questions and having those, that's going to make a big difference in terms of.
Yeah, I just want to pick up in that comment. I want to pick up in that comment with documentation. So absolutely, because again, that's the board can demonstrate that the processes were put in place, right? That we had them. I think I might have mentioned this before as well, but when it comes to minuting, there's different points of view in like minuting decisions that are made. I'm generally a fan of a more minimalist. Like I think you table, like the minutes should document what the issue was. The issue was discussed, various points of view were discussed, blah, 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 and decision. I've seen minutes that go on verbatim, like, well, Roger thought this and Sally thought that, and I thought this, and I don't think you need to my own view, you don't have to capture the entire conversation. A compromise might be to say, that the following factors were considered in the decision, and you would document whatever the key factors are. That might be kind of a middle ground. So, but I do believe that you want to be able to demonstrate that your decision process is documented, and that management has a framework for decision making that's well understood. The other thing I wanted to mention is maybe to answer your previous question, also thinking about appropriate use of an independent, not an independent committee, but sometimes if you do have independent board members, then there's a merit in the independent members meeting separate and apart from management or the CEO shareholder, so that they can maintain their independence. It's really becomes, the whole system becomes flawed or compromised when the independent directors can no longer act independently and objectively, right?
Right.
So it kind of stands to reason. And also an appropriate use of in camera. And again, different people have different likes and dislikes about going in camera. And in camera is you might go with the CEO, or sometimes often without the CEO. That gives an opportunity as well for maybe a little bit more frank discussion around, do you think so and so is really getting it? I'm kind of worried about this. I'm worried about that. Like, you might be able to, as a board, really use the in camera as a chance to just check yourself at the door.
Yeah, no, those are really great points. Just to tie back to documentation, and as you mentioned, the board's role is asking questions ultimately. I think, to a large degree, the documentation of a complex, difficult decision, which is recommended by management and made by management first, to be honest, that documentation should be operational in nature, and then a summarized version coming out to the board, and then the board is asking the right questions, validating the process, the values, the decision-making framework is being followed. And so, to your point, that allows for a lighter documentation of minutes, because the actual documentation is anchored down in operational, not at the governance level, right? If you're following best practices, I would suggest. So I think that when you talk about light documentation, that doesn't mean light as in light, it means light at that governance level, because you have the reliance that goes deeper and deeper with the process, the framework, the values to support it. So I think I just wanted to clarify that, or make that point, and see if you agree.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Perfect. So we're almost out of time. There's a couple frameworks that you want to chat about as we wrapped up, and then I'll do a little housekeeping. So
yeah, I just thought we'd leave them with those dilemmas. That I don't think we've got time where there's value to go through them. But I think, did you have them on your end? I think.
Yeah. Sorry, just 1 second.
Well, we
had a couple of dilemmas, but maybe the best thing to do, since we're out of time, is to share those when we share the certificates and the original 15 considerations, and that can be some homework that people can think about when they're trying to apply what we discussed. So we'll share that with the whole team here. Just wanted to thank you so much. I think it was a great set of examples and considerations, and I think that there's some tangible things we can do as potential board members or active board members, and then obviously in our roles within organizations as executives, to help the whole organization as well as the board make some good ethical decisions. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate that greatly. For all of you that joined, we had over 100 people. Very excited to see such a passion for ethics and governance. That's really, really a great sign for our community and what's happening around us, that people are so engaged and active in this learning and this topic in particular. So thank you so much for joining us. We're running out of time. Very quickly, I want to remind you that this Thursday we have a NetSuite demo. So Tech Thursday, be sure to register and join. It is also CPD if you attend live. There'll be a lot of learning for you in terms of NetSuite. We have this similar demo on the last Thursday of March, our last Tech Thursday. That's an Acumatica demo. So please be sure to join us. We're very excited to be new Acumatica partners. April 4th is our live event with Avante. It will sell out, so you need to get a seat, because there literally is not enough room for you if you don't get a seat. So it's a physical live in-person event, and if you don't get a seat, you can't come. So please do make sure to register and attend. It's going to be great. We're going to talk about their entrepreneurial stories, search funds, and then how tech can save businesses money. We have Amplify's AHA with Amplify, third Tuesday of every month, just like today that you're joining us. And we've got a great one coming up in April on talent. We have personal CFO in May, and we have HR in June. We take July and August off every year because we know you'd rather be camping or at the beach or golfing or what have you. And so no learning for you in July and August, but we'll be back in September with a whole new season. CPD certificates are sent to each of the registration people that joined us. And so you'll get that along with this video and other information that we mentioned in the next week or two. So Nikki will be sure to send that out. We're really, really excited to be able to support our community with experts like you. So thanks so much. And thanks for your participation. Have a great day.